start here, I wanted to mention a few things about the legality of collecting on both public and private lands. I collect, several hundred trees a year on public land, National Forest land, Bureau of Land Management land, State Forest land, and off of private land. And if you're going to collect, you need to make sure that it's legal, and you need to get permission so that you don't get yourself in trouble or ruin it for other collectors. Regulations vary from place to place. And a lot of National Forest lands, you can buy tree permits. Here's some transplant permits right here. You have to have a permit for each tree, and you attach it around the stem of the tree before you can load it into your vehicle or whatever you're going to use to move the tree from its location. Here's some other permits I've got. These are permits from Bureau of Land Management lands. This is a permit to collect deadwood, and then I also have some transplant permits for collecting trees here. These ones you attach one permit to a load, and it's marked on here how many items you're allowed to have into the load. So there's various ways to do it, but the main thing is that regulations vary from place to place, and you really need to know, to check into the situation and see if it's legal or not. In a lot of places you'll find near campgrounds, near hiking trails, in wilderness areas, in wildlife preserves, in any kind of state park or national monument, collecting is not going to be legal, and really you do not want to be in there trying to remove plants. When you have other areas, public lands like national forests that are managed more for resource development, in many cases in those areas collecting will be legal, but you need to check the regulations. Now when you're going to collect on a rock outcrop, rather than using a shovel, you're basically going to use a crowbar or a pry bar to pry the tree and free it from its environment. So we use a large crowbar like this, and we have some that are even bigger, and we do a lot of the work actually with a really small crowbar like this, with the end sharpened so it can cut through roots, and we use a mallet here, a 24-ounce hammer, to be able to drive that in there and free up the roots. I also make a pretty frequent use of a good pruning saw. I must go through about a half dozen of these a year at least to remove branches and to cut roots that I can't cut with this. If you have a big root, you don't really want to spend a lot of time banging on it and possibly breaking it up. Cutting it is much more easier on the tree. And then of course I use a pair of pruners, just a pair of bypass pruners here. Those are indispensable. And I also like to use just a knife. This is basically a kitchen knife almost, and it's got a blade that's it's pretty stiff, but it's real thin, and it's a little bit flexible. And I find that when I'm trying to explore around root systems, you can use this knife to kind of pry around there, and it'll get in there and help you free up the root system from the rock. And then of course I always take a big pack frame with me to get stuff back to my vehicle. Sometimes you may be quite a long way from your truck or whatever you're using by the time you find a tree, and it's just not practical to carry them. Especially if you have a big tree like that, you really want a pack frame to haul the thing out. Hi, I'm Andy Smith from Golden Arrow Bonsai. Today we're shooting a video on collecting trees up in the mountains. We're going to look at some junipers first, and then we're going to look at some pine trees. And we're going to look at some trees that can be collected, and we're going to look at a lot of trees that can't be collected. So why don't you come along with us and we'll see what we can find. Here's a beautiful little juniper. Look at this. Wouldn't that make a lovely bonsai? It's got deadwood that spirals around the trunk. It comes up, it loops around. Incredibly graceful. We actually find quite a few trees like this. As you see, the roots go into here. There's not a chance that tree would ever come out of there. You could probably pry that tree out of there and take it home and watch it die. But, when you find a tree like this, the best thing to do is just enjoy it for what it is and just leave it there, because it's not going to transplant. What we have here is a Rocky Mountain juniper on a granitic rock outcrop. We're up in the mountains here at about 7,000 feet, a very, very dry area. We got hundreds and hundreds of these, actually millions of these junipers around here. What makes this plant a little bit unusual is that I think this one might actually be able to come out of the rock and be transplanted. In this area, the winds almost never quit. It's not windy right now, but typically the winds will be anywhere from 25 to 50 miles an hour on an almost constant basis. And as you can see, the foliage is kind of ratty looking. That amount of wind and stuff will kill a lot of the tree. It beats the tree up. The foliage looks pretty yellow frequently when you first get them. But what I notice about this tree when I see it is you can tell it's healthy and growing. Even though the foliage is kind of stressed and yellow, it's got these nice blue tips. And here you can see this is, for a juniper in these kind of conditions, that's really vigorous growth for 1 year. That's almost an inch of growth. Most of these branches have got more like 1/8 of an inch of new growth on them for the year. And that's probably really typical. But when I transplant these into my nursery, that's one of the first encouraging signs I look for, is that I'll start seeing little blue tips on the foliage. And generally that's a good sign that the root system is functioning and the tree is actually trying to put on some growth. So now I'm going to poke around the base of these roots here and see what I can figure out whether or not this plant will come out. Now the reason I think it might come out is because it's basically the root system appears to be trapped under this boulder here, this small rock, and if we can pull this back, and I won't move it too much, because if the plant doesn't come out, we can just put the rock back and there'll be no harm done. But the first thing we want to do, or the first thing I do, looking at a plant like this, is just kind of rake away. There's a lot of old needles, dirt, and duff around the base of this plant. And we kind of want to get that stuff out of the way so that we can see if it's actually got a root system. And if you'll notice, the plant is, in this case, not that firmly attached. I mean, it's rather loose. It may have a root going way back into this crack, and that's what we have to kind of explore here as we try. All right, so cutting away around these roots like that, and a real thin bladed knife like this is real useful to be able to pry underneath stuff. It'll slide in a lot of crevices. You can see this whole thing is it looks like dirt, but actually it's a really fine mat of roots. You can kind of see some of the roots sticking out right here against my fingers. Very, very fine roots. It's all this whole thing, and of course we've got some limber pine roots in here too, and we'll have to, if we decide to take the tree, we'll have to deal with that. But so it looks like we do have a nice, what I would call a really nice, good root pad right around the base of the tree. The next question is as we try to separate this tree from the rock, can we keep it well attached to this root pad so that we can lift the whole thing out as a unit that's still really firmly attached? If we can, our survival will be excellent, just like a potted plant, basically. And if we can't, then we've got to decide either whether we want to take a risk on that tree or whether we just want to leave it here and in its natural environment. The smartest approach here would be to try and drive this in here and see what we get, and possibly, if this works, we may be able to put that larger crowbar in there and just kind of muscle that plant out of there. It's kind of hard to get in here, but you actually have to do a fair amount of research. You have to get a map, find the area where you intend to collect, and find out who's the owner of that land or the manager. You know, if it's a federal agency, you got to find out which federal agency. If it's a national monument, national park, national forest, Bureau of Land Management, reservation, wilderness area, whatever, whoever the manager is, and then you got to
talk to them and find out what their regulations are. And it varies a lot. I mean, it's hard for me to give an answer that's going to fit in all different places. I went to a place, a big state park here, where they do log, and I asked for permits to collect trees, and they told me I could not remove live material because of the visual impact. And I thought that made sense, except that they had a timber sale laid out there, and within a matter of about 6 months, all the trees I wanted to collect were pretty much sawdust. So the regulations vary a lot, and they're not always what you'd think they are either. And you really need to check into that so you don't get yourself in trouble. And even more importantly, I don't want bonsai collectors to get a bad name as people that are just out there ripping stuff out of the hills. You want to stay within the law.
I'm trying to cut a root. In fact, I just did cut a root, kind of a big anchor root that was going down into the crevice there. And the idea of that was to see what I'm seeing now as I've worked on this tree here is we've got this pretty good root pad, which is nice and solid, and these are juniper roots, not pine roots. The pine probably, I would assume, runs up the hill there. But so we got a nice pad of juniper roots here, and I've loosened up the tree significantly more than it was. But when I wiggle the tree, the juniper roots are only moving a little bit, which tells me that the root system goes down into the rock and probably pinches off down in there and then comes back up and makes the root pad here, which means that there's an excellent chance that I might be able to get this tree out without the roots. So this is a tree that would be a good one just to back away from and leave here. We haven't done any significant amount of damage to the roots. We've pried around them quite a bit, but we'll fill all this back in with dirt and roll the rock in place again to restore its former support system and stuff. But after working on this tree for a little bit, we might be able to get this one out, but it doesn't look nearly as promising as it did at first, and it would probably be better just to leave it. So I think we'll just start covering it back up, and we'll move on and see if we can find a different one. Well, here we have another juniper, and I think this one might come up. I don't know. We've looked around a little bit at several others. This particular tree, it's kind of a big tree, a little bit large probably, what we think of for bonsai, but it does have a nice feature here. It's got a nice shari, that is deadwood, running all the way up the trunk, and then of course it goes up about probably 6 feet there. And then the branches on this tree are actually pretty young and flexible, so we could do a lot with this tree with wire, and we can shorten the height a little bit. But this is probably relatively a young tree for this area. This tree might be, I would guesstimate, around 140, 150 years old. As you can see, it's been growing in this little kind of a runoff channel in the rock, so that when it does rain, this tree gets a fair amount of water, which accounts for its pretty vigorous growth and its full mat of foliage here. Another thing I want to mention is I've heard many people say that if a juniper gets berries on it, that's a sign of it being under stress. But in nature, of course, they make berries all the time because that's how they reproduce. So that's very common to see a collected tree covered with berries. And this would be a female plant then, with the berries on it. But I've poked around a little bit here, and I think this one's got a pretty good chance of being collectible. When I wiggle the tree, I can see the whole root mat here moving along with it, and that gives me hope that we may be able to collect the thing with pretty much of an intact root system. Now, it's very dry right now. We haven't really had the autumn rains yet that are basically something we look for when we're going to start collecting in the fall. We're a little bit early. The plant should still do fine. This is the time of year when they'll start growing new roots. But I did bring some water along, and I want to just to a little extent, try and maybe soften up the root pad a little bit. I'm going to let it run off, and then after we get this out, we'll soak it down really good before we transport it anywhere. But this might just help take a little bit of the brittleness out of those dry roots. So the first thing I'm going to do here, I see that we got some rocks kind of around the base of the root system, and I want to remove that stuff because if I lift the plant with those rocks in it and they fall out, that can just completely tear up the root system. And getting these rocks out here will also give me some idea of what the root system really is. Occasionally you run into the situation where you'll have a plant and you're prying on it and it looks like it has an excellent root system, and what it'll turn out to be is just a big flat rock underneath the plant, and that's making the whole root system move. And so the root system is not nearly as well attached as you thought it was. So you gotta always be kind of careful. There's a lot of things that appear like they're collectible that really aren't. I don't know if you can see from this distance, but here again we have a really, really dense mat of fine juniper roots there. And these really fine roots, these ones that are about the diameter of a sewing thread, those are the ones that we want to put in the bonsai pot to do all the work for us and keep the tree alive. So the root system is exactly what we want, and the only question is, can we lift this plant out and keep the root system intact and connected? If we can, basically you've got a situation very much like a potted plant, and the survival is very, very high. So what I'm just going to keep doing here is just kind of prying around a little bit, trying to see the limits of this root system and find out where is it anchored to the rock. That's the key question of the moment here. And when I'm doing this, when I'm working on these trees and digging around the roots, I always try and keep in mind that the tree may not come out. And I don't want to shovel all this stuff down the hill and stuff. I want to keep it so that if the plant doesn't come out, I can rebuild it some growing medium around the root system. And frequently what will happen then with a plant that you can't remove, the initial work that you do on it may loosen it up enough. If you rebuild all this stuff around there and pile it up so that it can continue growing, well, in a few years you may come back and it may well come out then. So it kind of appears to me that the plant's mainly attached somewhere right up here at the top, which in general, what I have found over the years when you're collecting plants that are growing on a slope like this, the root system is never going to run downhill. It always runs back up into the channel. And so the roots that you're going to need to find and disconnect are usually almost always going to be uphill from the plant if it's growing on a slope. Alright, so we got the plant out. And if you look at this, I don't know if you can see it against my hand there, but this is all just a huge mat of very, very fine hair roots. And that's what makes collecting off of rock outcrops is very desirable, is that you can get a very, very fine mat of roots that transplant really well. Once we have the tree collected, the next step is to wrap it up very tightly. After taking all the time to collect these roots, you know, the last thing we want to do is beat this thing up while we're trying to get back to our vehicle or something. So we want to wrap the root system just as tightly as we can so that it's completely immobile. I think I've found that a lot of trees that maybe are collected in the field in good shape may be killed just on the trip back to the truck if it's over rough terrain. So we just need to wrap the thing up very securely. Okay, so here's the start of a future bonsai. Well, we've been looking around for hours and hours and we really haven't had much luck finding a good tree, but just now, way up on this ledge here, we found a pretty nice looking, I mean it would make an excellent bonsai, about a probably 400 to 500 year old juniper. And I'm kind of hopeful that this one might come out. And the reason for that, what we want to do is kind of poke around the roots here, uncover some of this, and sure enough you can, well I can feel that it's got a very firm, solid root pad right there, which is what I was hoping for. So we got a very nice mat, solid mat of good, fine hair roots right here on this side, right against the base of the trunk. And over on the other side, the tree seems to be kind of loosely attached. Rather than being completely trapped in the rock, it's got a long, very long, heavy root that runs down. And the tree's kind of sheltered by its situation in the rock here. And if we're lucky and this tree will pry up, we might, and it looks like it probably will here, and look at that, by golly, the whole root system will come right up with the tree, and that's everything we need to keep this tree alive. So all that remains now, I mean, a tree like this is really a 1 in a million. This is perfect, just really perfect, because that's a perfect root system. It'll fit right into a bonsai pot, and as you can see, it's very well attached to the tree. All that remains to get the tree out is to free it from this root over here, this big anchor root, and wrap it up. The first thing I'm going to do, since it's very, very dry right now, to help protect the root system and take the stress off, I brought some water up here, and I'm going to put some water on the fine root mat over here to kind of make it a little more flexible, and then I'll water it again as soon as we get it back out of the rock and to the vehicle. And really, when the roots are this dry, the water tends to want to kind of run off, but it will soak into a certain extent, and it'll help make things a little more flexible and maybe take some stress off the plant. So I put a ½ gallon on there, and it is soaking in. We'll put a little bit more here. Now with this tree, all we have to do to get this tree out is cut this root right here. And I'm going to leave about, I don't know, 4 or 5 inches of this root to help anchor the tree into the pot. But there's no hair roots attached to this at all. The root system that's attached to this root is way down here, you know, a good 6 feet from the tree. And we're just going to lose that. We're not going to worry about that because we got a really good root system over here. And now, there is a risk when you do that, because junipers have a kind of a veinal system. This root is going to feed some stuff that may be put under more stress than the rest of the tree. However, the root system over here is very good and seems like it feeds the same vein, so I don't think we'll really have too many problems with that. So right now I'm just going to cut this root and we'll lift the tree out. Alright, so I've cut this root here, And now this is a very easy tree to collect, this particular one. I wish they were all this easy. Look at this, what a lovely plant. Absolutely beautiful. And this is an excellent root system right here. As you can see, the fine, this is just kind of a mat of very nice hair roots. It's not really very big, but it's very, very efficient. And that's exactly what we want to collect to go into a pot. So now we just wrap this up very carefully so that it'll make the trip back home all right. And you know, with a tree like this, I would be very confident, as long as we provide the right conditions for it, this tree should grow with no problem for us. It should transplant very easily. Now we've got the tree all wrapped up securely, so the roots shouldn't take too much of a beating going down the hill. I'm just going to strap it on the pack frame here and get it down the mountain to our vehicles. Here we go. Well, now that we've seen some junipers, let's go look at some ponderosa pine. There's lots of them right around here, and I found some pretty good ones right down this road. So let's go. Here we have a typical situation with ponderosa pine. A really nice little tree. A tree like this would be anywhere between, say, 80 and maybe 125 years old, growing on a rock, a type of a granitic rock. And this is probably the most common situation you'll find. The tree's actually growing a little crack here, right there. And right there. And really with a tree like this, you have, when you move it, the stem moves, but you don't really see a root system moving at all, which means the tree's anchored very firmly way down in there. Your chances of getting this plant are very slim. A tree like this, you know, you're better off to just leave it and look for something that wants to come up. The easier the tree is to collect, the higher the chances of survival. If you have to work for hours and hours and hours to get one out, probably it's in a situation where maybe it's best to just leave it alone. So this is a tree that's just going to stay there. Look at this tree. This is a beautiful old ponderosa pine. Now, with the trees that I've sampled in the past, a tree like this could be anywhere from, say, 140 or 50 years to maybe, I would doubt this is 200 years old, but I would guess between 150 and 175 years old. And it's a captive in this very narrow kind of crevice in the rock here, and that's what's made it grow so slow. There's almost there's no resources for the tree to grow, so it grows very, very, very slowly. And if you think about it, the very first bonsai were collected from the mountains, and they were put in very small, shallow pots with a very kind of a coarse soil mix. The bonsai pot kind of replicates this high mountain environment, and you know, bonsai culture does other things to help dwarf trees. So in a way, when we do bonsai, we're kind of replicating the natural environment of a tree like this. Now, I looked at this tree. This would be a great tree to collect for a bonsai. It's got a big base that's partly covered up here. However, when I looked at the tree, I pried it up a little bit to see what kind of a root system it had. It had a very, very small root system. The chances are that the tree would not survive if it was collected. And so rather than risking it, what I did was I raked up quite a bit of gravel and mixed in some old needles and duff, and so I built up a soil thing around the base of the tree, and then I'm going to hold it in place with this piece of deadwood here. And if I'm lucky, maybe in a few years this tree will develop enough new roots in this stuff that it could be collectible, but we don't know. But certainly right now you would not want to try and collect this tree. But I just wanted to mention some things about the growth. I get asked frequently why these trees are so contorted. If you look at it, every place where the tree curves, where there's a sharp bend, there's a nub of a dead branch. So basically, this is kind of like the clip and grow technique of bonsai. In other words, like the tree was growing up here, the leader died, so a side branch, which was probably quite long already, took over. Right here, where it turns sharply right there, there's a dead nub. So the leader died again. Maybe a porcupine got it, maybe wind, hail, who knows. Insects, a side branch took over again. And the same thing, with every turn on this tree, there's a dead branch where the leader, the growing tip of the tree died and a side branch took over. And over hundreds of years, that creates this very contorted shape. And then we have this, this deadwood, which if we clean this up, this would be quite beautiful. And basically that's caused by, I think, mostly by the death of a branch, by insects or disease or wind. It kills a branch, and then the cambium that branch was feeding dies, and after it dies the bark just peels away, and then the wind just continues to open it up and carve on it, and eventually after a century or so you end up with a very beautiful kind of exquisite plant. So now I'm just going to put this piece of deadwood back up here, and we're going to leave this one alone because I don't think it would be a good one to collect. Maybe we'll put a little more, put some more rocks and gravel up in there, stuff to hold this in place. Look at this tree. This is just a dynamic pine. I love this tree. I first found this tree about, I guess about 8 years ago. And as you can see, it's growing into a crevice here. There's really no way to collect a plant like this. And in fact, I wouldn't even try it. But it's just a lovely tree, and every now and then I come back to look at it. This tree, you might think because of the huge size of the base and all the gnarly curves and everything that it's really, really ancient. And it looks quite ancient, but I really don't think it is, for a couple of reasons. One, if you look at the crown of the tree, it's very full and healthy. It doesn't have that really sparse, kind of starved look that these trees get when they're really, really old. The other thing is, when a tree gets pinched into a crack like this, what tends to happen is it can't put out any lateral roots to support itself. So when the wind blows, it tends to whip back and forth, which injures the base of the tree. And the injury causes scar tissue to form, which causes the base to swell. And eventually the injury causes the tree to have this huge, enormous base, which holds the tree in place instead of lateral roots. And that may make the tree look a lot older than it really is. I would probably estimate this tree between, it's really hard to say because it's got characteristics of a young and an old tree, but I would say between 125 and, you know, maybe 175, something like that. But just a wonderful plant. And you see a lot of this. You know, probably most of the pines that you see really are not in a situation where they'll be collectible. I estimate around 1 out of 100 can actually be lifted and also has the characteristics that we want for bonsai. But, you know, what a great plant that is. Now where we're going to collect today, if you'll notice, this tree's got a stripe of blue paint on it. We're inside the marked boundary of a timber sale here. And these trees that are marked are the trees that are going to be left. The trees that are not marked, it's at the logger's option whether he's going to take it or not. Now this sale was marked a few years ago and it'll be cut soon, very soon. So any tree we take out of here, if we don't collect it, it's probably going to be gone within the next couple of years because they're going to be coming through here and cutting and skidding logs. And then when they're done with that, they hire thinning crews to go in and clean up the area, and generally they any tree that's kind of contorted or twisted, basically the things that we want for bonsai, is going to be removed because in a timber production area, you want to be focusing on growing nice, straight, healthy trees that you can get a wood product out of. And now, not all of our forest lands are managed for that purpose, but this area is. Now, if you'll notice right behind me, up where my boy is, there's a very nice big ponderosa pine up there. And that's the tree I'm going to try and go collect here in a few minutes. This tree's growing on a boulder at about 5,500 feet, maybe 5,800 feet elevation. And after checking the tree, the main thing I do is see if the tree will wiggle, is to look at the base of the roots. And with this one, I mean, I'm amazed the wind hasn't taken this out of here a long, long time ago, but it hasn't. This tree it's not only very loose, but when you wiggle it, I don't know if you can see on the camera there, the whole root system moves with the tree. So that lets me know I got a very well connected, good mat of fine roots that's connected right to the base of the tree. And a tree like this, you know, the survival rate's extremely high, in the upper 90s. And as I was saying before, you know, this tree is probably going to be either hit by another falling tree or taken out by thinners within the next year or two. So we're gonna try and take it out of here today. The first thing I do when collecting a tree like this, basically, is to clean away all the duff so I can actually look at what is the root system. And the duff just kind of covers that up. So I want to scrape away as much of this as I need to allow myself to see. Now if you'll notice here, you see these really fine hair roots coming out? I mean, all of this stuff, this is old decomposed needles and bark here. Not really what you'd call a soil mix. If you look at that, it's basically just the root system for the tree integrated into a mix of its own decomposed bark and needles, and that's really perfect. I mean, that's the best situation you can get, really. Much better than soil. Now here again, I'm going to move the tree, and if you look at that, you can see, for one, the tree is not very firmly attached to the rock, and for another, this whole root system moves with the plant. I mean, we're very firmly attached here. Even when I push it this way, you can see all this raises up, and see all the roots sticking out of this? That's an ideal situation here. So this is basically a perfect situation for collecting a tree for bonsai. With this tree, we could collect, if we wanted to, 100% of the root system. But of course we don't. That would be far too many roots to go into a bonsai pot. So since I got a very good, well-established root system, I'm not afraid to cut off any of it and leave just what I want to transplant. So probably I'm going to cut it like this, kind of around here and around here, roughly about the size of the pot that I imagine this tree would look good sitting in. And once it's done, this tree is loose enough. I think probably with this one, just about all we have to do is cut those roots and the tree will be free. Now obviously we have a really big root here going down, and probably we're going to have to find that root right there and cut that to get the tree out. But the rest of this is all really fine hair roots. So what I'm going to do is just take the saw here, and I'll start over on this side and just kind of work my way around the tree. And see, this is not even, it's just a few inches deep. And rather than have the saw tear it up, anytime I hit a root of any size, I get out the nippers to free it up a little bit. Here's a bigger root right here.
With the species I collect, and this is just basically in the mountains. I mean, you know, people that collect down in Louisiana and stuff that get different trees do it completely differently. But in the mountains, the trees that you want to collect basically are captives in rock formations. And that's what makes them collectible, actually. A lot of times you see those trees in a rock and you wiggle them and it's like they're cemented in. You think, well, how could you collect that? And that's true, you can't. But it's that one tree out of 100 or one out of 1,000 that's in almost like a natural bonsai pot. And those are the ones that you can take out and have a very high transplant success rate.
Of course, what I want to look for is there's going to be places, look at that, how loose the tree is already. but there's going to be places where the roots go into crevices in the rock and hold that tree in, and those are the places I need to find before I can really lift it, because obviously if you start really pulling on the tree and it's still connected, you can do an awful lot of damage to the root system you've worked so hard to gather.
You know, those real fine, like steel wool type roots on the tree that are around the base of the tree like that, those are the ones that actually absorb the nutrients and the water that keep the tree alive. And so that's what you really want to collect. And hopefully, if you know, the ideal situation is to get a tree that has a good radial root system of larger roots supporting a really dense network of these really fine roots. And then you know, you separate the tree from the rock by cutting some of these anchor roots that are holding it in there. And when you lift the thing out, it's just solid. It's just a good solid root mat. I mean, you could carry it home without even wrapping it up. And that's, if you get that, that's perfect. You know, less ideal, a situation we see sometimes is where you'll have a tree that'll have one big solid root that might be the diameter of your wrist maybe, and then off of that root it'll have a jillion of these really fine hair roots. And what I found is that in that situation it's very fragile. It's real easy for all those hair roots to tear away from that one big root because it doesn't have a supporting network. So, you know, what you look for, hopefully, what you really want to find is a tree with a, you know, it's a root system. It's not just roots, it's a whole system of roots that all work together.
I might want to mention one other thing here. It's very dry right now. Haven't had any rain in quite a while. But the root system, although it is dry, it's really not powder dry. It's got a fair amount of moisture inside there, which helps a great deal in keeping the thing together. When the roots get so dry they're powdery, it's a very, very bad time to collect. This is about as dry as you want them to get. If they get much drier than this, it's better to just wait, come back after it rains. So now I'm moving the tree here. Now I got some really loose stuff over here, and if I leave that on, I'm just going to cut that off, because if I leave that on, it's probably just going to flop down and it might rip off a lot more of the root system than I want. So probably I think I'll just prune this kind of right across there so that that floppy piece doesn't end up damaging some of the nice roots that we have got here.
Probably with ponderosa pine, you know, on your rock outcrop environments, you might average 200 trees an acre, maybe. And I figure with ponderosa pine, I probably am able to collect about one tree out of 100. But it's not like 2 trees per acre. A lot of times, it may be less than 1 tree out of 100 actually, because you may look over, you know, several acres and not find a single tree, and then you may find, you know, 3 or 4 within maybe a half acre area. You know, with junipers, it's much, much less. 1 out of 1,000, I would say. I mean, you look, so we've looked over sometimes 200 acres of rock and spent the whole day and not found a single collectible tree. And it's not that there's not trees there. There's lots and lots of these old twisted up trees, but it's finding one that has a root system that will allow it to come out of the rock and safely transplant. That's the rare thing. I mean, these old trees are to some extent unusual, but in the right environment, that's the normal growth pattern. So they're not really, I mean, there's whole mountainsides of these twisted up trees. What's unusual is to find one that's got the surface roots and a situation where you can get it out of there. So
I notice in this corner when I'm working here that there's still something holding it in there. Probably the biggest mistake you could make with a tree like this is to try and lift it out of there before you're absolutely certain that you've freed it all up. One root hung up in a rock could ruin the whole works for you. So you gotta I think I can feel something right down in there that might be what's keeping it in there. I don't know if I can get these pruners in there or not. All right, now I cut that root there, and as you can see now, that has considerably freed up the tree, although we're still connected down here. And so I can start pulling the tree out. I can feel there's something right there, so I need to work on this area.
The ends of the roots, when they're growing, they swell up, and then they're a much lighter color. Like junipers are kind of a pinkish color when they're growing. Pines are white. Spruce are really white. But they look much different. I mean, they look almost like a miniature spaghetti noodle in a sense on the end. Usually the last inch to 2 inches, that's where it's growing.
Now it seems like everything is freed up, but this is really a good time not to make a mistake and just try and lift the tree. We want to kind of very gently lift up on it. It's cracking right there. There could be some big rocks in here that could rip the whole root system apart if we just pulled it out of there. So at this point, this is a point when you tend to get impatient and want to just lift your tree up. And actually, this is when you really have to be careful and see what you've actually got here before you. And I think we've got what we want. Let's try leaning it back the other way and see if this is free. There's something holding it here. Okay, I think at this point, tree actually is free. Sure enough. Now I'm going to lift this up and put it on the rock over here, and I want to look at the bottom of the root pad for a minute, if I can lift this. It's always a little bigger than we think. But can you focus on these roots? Mm-hmm. If you'll notice, it's very, as I said, very dry right now. But if you look, these are new roots. These are all growing. Now that's a really good sign. That tells me that what we have here is a functional, active root system. Not just a root. I mean, this is an integrated root system that works together to feed these trees, keep this tree alive. And the fact that it's active right now, that the roots in fact are growing, lets me know that when I put it in a pot, they'll probably continue to try to grow, and our transplant success with something like this would be very, very high. You know, the upper 90%. You hardly lose a tree like this unless you do something wrong. It also tells me that when you're bringing ponderosa pine into a wetter environment, I believe these trees that have evolved in a kind of a high, dry mountain environment need a lot of oxygen in their root systems. And if you put them in a soil mix that's too heavy, you basically will smother the tree. They like a lot of water actually, but they like to be able to breathe. And they need to breathe. As you can see, it's very, very dry here, and the roots are doing fine. They're growing. So now I'm going to just wrap this up in burlap and see if I can talk somebody into carrying this down the mountain for me. One last thing I wanted to say here. After removing the tree, the right thing to do is to rake all this duff and stuff back into the hole or back into the depression in the rock. Ponderosa pine are very vigorous cedars, and in the not too distant future, I would expect to see another plant growing here, and and in another 100 years or so we'll have another bonsai probably. But you know, I kind of want to maintain that environment. I don't want to just leave a bare, eroded hole there. So I always try and rake all the duff and stuff back into the cavity. Well, this is the moment of truth, really. After traveling 1,000 miles, searching the cliffs for hours and hours, and finally collecting a tree that we liked, now we have to open up the root ball and see what we've really got and whether we've really made a good job or made a mess of what we were doing here. Now if we can focus in on the bottom of this, you can see that this is not really dirt. This is a solid mat of roots. And that's why you can get by with a relatively small root system like this. It would be nice if this went all the way around the tree, and we frequently get them like that. But this is very good the way it is. I mean, this tree has an excellent chance, I would say. Now we don't want to pot the tree necessarily in this, it's got soil around it mixed in with the roots. And it's got a lot of, basically this soil is composed of some clay and some old decomposed juniper needles. And so basically what we do usually, what I like to do anyway, is just kind of take a pressure sprayer and not too roughly, but I want to wash away as much of that excess stuff as I can without really getting into it. I mean, I don't really want to cause a lot of disruption in the root system right now, but anything that's just kind of loose, mucky stuff, I want to get that off, and I want to open this up. I don't know if you can see there, this root here, even though it was very dry up on the mountain, the root system is growing right now. We usually think of the roots as growing only in the spring and fall, but I think at high elevations where the growing season is very short, the roots grow whenever they can, basically, which means if you get a little bit of a wet spell in the summer or whatever, the roots will grow. So what I'm trying to do is just open this up enough so that after I put this in a pot, this root system will be able to breathe and we'll be able to have air and water flow through it. Alright, that's about good enough. I don't really want to open this thing completely up. It's pretty well known that it's kind of hazardous to interfere with the root system too much at this point. But I've got it opened up enough that I think water and air can get in there to some extent. So now I've prepared a box, a wooden box. I could put this tree in a bonsai pot, but I think a wooden box is at least as good as a bonsai pot. One of the reasons being that you know, a wooden box will not get nearly so hot, and it's much more conducive to rooting a new plant. So this is kind of a heavy plant. We might have to use some guy wires to hold this one in place. I'm not sure yet. But I've got 3 sets of wires here. The first set to go over this piece of root that I deliberately left when I freed the tree. I left it just for this purpose here to help hold the tree in place. And that will do quite a bit right there. Okay, now we want to fill the rest of the pot with soil, making sure that we don't leave any gaps underneath. The soil mix I use is just pure turfus and about probably 25% crushed pine bark. That seems to work good for a lot of different coniferous plants. If I have it, I also mix in a little bit of number 3 turkey grit to kind of make it a little coarser. I don't have any right now. But basically just something that's very kind of porous and open, and will let a lot of air and water into the root system and back out again without trapping anything in there. These ones we're not going to do very tight because I don't want them to crush those fine roots. Just kind of lay those in there like that. So now I will attach some guy wires to the sides of the pot. The tree, as you can see, still wiggles a little bit. And when you're trying to get something started as a transplant, you really want it to be locked in there. I'm going to water this tree very thoroughly, and I'm going to put it in a cold frame where it's in the shade, a white poly house basically. It'll stay in the shade, and it'll be misted every day until I start really seeing a lot of new growth. Although these trees come from almost a desert environment, they really respond well once you transplant them to shade and to a higher humidity environment, and that really seems to help them get established very quickly. So I would say this tree has an excellent chance. Everything went very well. Alright, well here we have our too big for a bonsai. And let's get the roots ready and put this one into a pot. I guess the thing we don't need to have it tagged anymore. Let's throw that away. And just kind of spray this off and get rid of the excess of that stuff. Now it's well known that pine trees especially depend on mycorrhizae on the roots, and you really don't want to bare root these things. But you know, if we leave say a pretty good mat of the original material around in here, and we can free up all the ends a little bit, it'll actually help the plant transplant quite a bit.
If I got a good solid tree, I'll try and get all the what I call the excess of the root pad off, the stuff that doesn't really have roots in it, that's just dirt or duff or whatever it is. Try and get all that stuff off of there, and hose it off so that it's got roots sticking out all around the edges and on the bottom and the top. I pot it in a kind of a porous growing mix with a little bit of pine bark in it. And then ideally, and I don't always have room to do that for every tree, so I'm kind of selective. The ones that seem weaker get more care than the ones that had a really robust root system. But you know, I like to put them, if I can, in a shade house and mist them every day. And what I've found is like the junipers and the spruces really respond well to that. The pines respond to it to some extent, but not as much. You know, the pines, you can almost just set them right out in the sun right away, and they don't seem to mind that. But if you have one that's weak or something, it definitely gives it a boost to put it in the shade and kind of keep it misty. But you don't want to keep the soil soaked, you just want to keep it humid in there.
Well, I said this tree was too big for bonsai, and it is. But luckily for me, I happen to have a pot that's too big for bonsai too, and I think it's just the right size for this tree, which was one reason I thought it might be a good one to collect if we can lay it in there. Okay, now we want to fill the rest of the pot with soil. Making sure that we don't leave any gaps underneath.